Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the Extra Mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now, your host, Jackson Mummy, owner of the Celebration Bar Review.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to episode 192 of the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson Mummy. So glad to be with you in this spring week. Gosh, we're in April. Is that amazing? We are now just a couple of weeks away from the first big state to release exam results from February 2017. That'll be Florida. It'll be around the middle of the month, so we'll keep you updated, and good luck to everybody that's waiting on their Florida exam results. And we've got some other smaller jurisdictions that tend to release results in these first couple of weeks of April. So we're just beginning that season, and good luck to everyone. Now, if this is your first time on the podcast with us, we want to welcome you. We get together every Wednesday to talk about all things bar exam related, and you can get these podcasts in a couple of different ways. You can go to our website to watch the video version by typing in celebrationbarreview.com/ then the episode number. So this is episode 192. So it's celebrationbarreview.com/192, and the entire video version is there. You can also get this podcast however you get your podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, lots of different ways. So however you'd like to do that, that's great. And if you'd like to go back into our archives, we've been doing these episodes for almost 3 years now. You can go to our website. You will see a link at the top for podcasts. Just go there and you'll see all the show notes and all the episodes going back to episode number 1. So lots of good information there. If you're waiting for your bar exam results, we did an episode a while back. We'll link to that, where we talked about 5 things you can do while you're waiting for your results. And of course, we've got people just starting out now for July 2018 and even February 2019. And I want to specifically invite those of you taking the bar exam coming up in July or next February to a special live webinar this Thursday. That would be April 5th at 7 p.m. Eastern. The title of the webinar is How to Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. It's a look at the powerful, proven way to pass. We're going to take a look at 4 steps that successful bar takers follow in order to pass their exams. Lots of case studies, lots of examples, lots of information that you can take action on right away. Now, it's completely free, but you do need to register, and you can do that really in one of a couple of different ways. Go to celebrationbarreview.com/webinar to sign up. Or if you're watching on the video page, just scroll down this page. You can click on the button there as well. And if you're listening to this webinar, in the show notes, you'll see a link there. So lots of different ways to get on the webinar Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern. That would be 4 p.m. Pacific. Now, if that time does not work for you, you will also see an option for an on-demand version of the webinar. Just click on that and you can schedule your own time, watch the webinar at your convenience, and email your questions in to me, and that works just as well. But obviously, we'd love to have you on the live webinar on Thursday. So make sure that you check that out, register. We've had thousands of people go through that webinar, and it's been incredibly successful, so I don't want you to miss out on that information. Well, in today's episode, we're going to be doing something that I've been doing recently, and talking about bar exams in the news and things that are going on. We had some big news in the last couple of weeks that I've been holding off on just a little bit of talking about, and that had to do with the overall pass rate statistics and the first-time bar taker statistics that were released by the American Bar Association as a result of a change in June of 2017 to law school questionnaires. Now, if you follow the bar exam, and I presume you do since you're watching or listening to this podcast, you probably saw these stories. They were talked about in the ABA pretty extensively. They were reported on in a number of different legal forums and blogs. And the upshot of the news was this: that based on results from 2015 through 2017, there was nearly an 88% bar passage rate among ABA-approved law schools for their graduates on the bar exam, with a whole lot of caveats. Well, the whole lot of caveats didn't get much attention. The number 87.8% got a lot of attention, and suddenly we were seeing stories about how there's no real crisis in bar exam, everybody's passing, what's the big deal? And frankly, you may have taken some comfort in that, but I suspect many of the people in our audience would be taking a little bit of unhappiness, like, hey, wait a minute, I didn't pass my bar exam, or I'm worried about passing my bar exam. Is this number legit? Is it real? Should I feel like, oh yeah, I should be passing. If I'm not passing, there's something wrong with me. Well, in today's episode, what I want to do is break down 5 things that I think need to be examined at least. And I'm going to be a bit of a curmudgeon, be a little bit more detailed in terms of some things that I think are not being as widely reported with respect to these numbers that are coming out. And we'll link to some of the articles. We'll actually link to the spreadsheet itself. You can check out the numbers and see the methodology for yourself. But I think it's an important discussion to have because it seems to me that there are a number of underreported parts to this story. And I'm afraid that the underreported parts tend to give a misleading impression of what's actually going on. I mean, frankly, this is a little bit of the groupthink and group speak that tends to occur in our profession. And by our profession, I mean not only the legal profession, but the bar review industry. And I'm not particularly fond of that approach. I don't think it serves a lot of constituencies very well. It serves the big box law schools, the big box bar reviews, the people that go to the top 20 law schools. They're going to pass the bar. We knew that already. They knew that already. So no, there's nothing here to look at, folks. But when you start expanding that to all bar takers across the whole country, well, I think the numbers really don't bear out everything that's being said. So I want to look at 5 things that I think we ought to examine in a little bit more detail. Now, I was thinking of calling this episode Lies, Damned Lies, and Statistics, but, the truth is it's not really so much that it's lying as it is selective choice of information. So let's look at these 5 items, the first of which is this. The aggregate numbers that are being reported skew very heavily in favor of big law schools. Let me say it again. The aggregate numbers skew very heavily in favor of big law schools. Look, here's how the law school industry works. There are some massive mega law schools out there, schools like my alma mater, Georgetown, and Harvard and others, where there is a very high pass rate and a very large number of people who go to those schools. At the other end of the spectrum, we have a lot of smaller schools. In fact, most of you probably went to a smaller law school, not a bigger one. That is to say, a school that might have 100 or fewer bar takers in a particular year. The reality is that when we put all of the numbers together as aggregates, these big law schools carry a disproportionate weight, and so they tend to move the averages in their favor. What they don't show you is how wide the variance actually is. Here's one of the interesting things. 1 out of every 6 law schools had a pass rate that was under 80% for this reported group. And we're going to talk about what that group is in just a minute. But I think it's important to understand that there are a lot of schools out there for whom that pass rate did not apply at all, not even close. And so when you see the overall number that says 88%, you start thinking, wow, 88% of everybody, that's awesome. That's not actually the way it worked out. What happened was these big law schools tended to carry much higher percentages of passing rates and therefore lifted the entire grouping. When you look at the data by school, what you're going to see is a whole bunch of schools that had pass rates that were well below 80%, that only had 100 or 50 or a couple hundred at most bar takers. So what happens is you got a lot of people going to a lot of schools who aren't passing at that kind of rate, and yet we see these big schools having the huge numbers, and that's part of what blows those percentages out of the water, at least in my view. I think it's important to keep in mind that most of the schools that were here were not hitting that 88% number. Now, is that to make you feel bad or to say, bah humbug? No. I think it's great that we've got people passing the bar, whatever that number is. I just want to make sure that we're being accurate about how those numbers are reported and what we're thinking about and what they mean. So that's our first point, that the aggregate numbers really are misleading. I think you've got to break it down more by school, which is why it's important to look at jurisdictions. So you take all the schools that had students taking the Florida bar, the Cal bar, whatever it might be, and you're going to get a very different picture than when you get the aggregate large number. Now, the second point I want to make about these reports is that they gloss over something that to the writer may not be a big deal, but to the bar taker is a huge deal. And that is that these numbers represent the people that pass after 2 years. That means 4 bar exams. Now, you may say, well, 4 bar exams, that's not much. But let me tell you, if you've had to take the bar exam 4 times, it feels like an eternity. It feels like a lot. It doesn't feel like, oh gosh, no big deal, I just passed. It's a big deal. And one of the things that this statistic glosses over is that most people take the big box bar reviews, you know the ones, and they fail. I mean, the first time fail pass rate, as we're going to see in a moment, is much, much greater than is reported here, because when we take all of the bar takers from all of the sources, most people aren't passing the bar, particularly in big states like California and Florida. And so as a result, there are a lot of people who take that course, fail, and maybe take it again and fail again, and then do something else, and then finally pass the bar, at least on their 4th try. I think it's important to keep in mind that these numbers represent the people that took the bar exam 4 times. Now, if we could take your first 4 times that you took the bar and look at that pass rate, that's very different than the right out of the box, first time out of law school, or first time ever taking the bar exam pass rate. And yet it's one of the pieces of information that kind of got glossed over. It was just, well, within 2 years they pass. Well, okay, that's great. But if we said the people that pass within 3 years or 4 years or 5 years or 6 years, I mean, the point is that it takes folks a while because the primary thing that they're doing to study for the bar is not terribly effective. Now, again, I have to caveat that. If you went to a top 20 law school, it really doesn't matter how you study for the bar. You're probably going to pass. You probably have the experience, the ability, the writing skills to pass no matter what you do. But for the vast majority of people that didn't go to one of those schools, that's a different matter. And so taking the standard memorize, recite approach for many of those people does not work, and they have to change their approach in order to pass the bar. These statistics don't reflect that switch. They just simply lump everybody together and say, if you passed at some point in your first 4 tries, we're going to call you a bar passer for our purposes. And that's great. We want people to pass the bar. But I think it's important to remember that it's not really a number of first-time taking the bar using traditional bar review methods. That would be a very interesting number and one that we don't have, but certainly not as high as what we're seeing in these studies. The third thing that we want to talk about when we're looking at these reports from the ABA and the law schools themselves, and I know that this will be, I suppose, something like heresy to many, but law schools make up numbers. They manipulate. Anyone that's familiar with the U.S. News and World Report law school rankings is undoubtedly familiar with all the game playing that goes on among law schools. They manipulate a lot of their numbers. They do a lot of things in a lot of ways to keep those numbers looking good for the reports so that they can continue to bring in new students and continue to stay in business. And so the reality here is that law schools, frankly, can play a lot of games with these numbers. There were several thousand bar takers who did not report their results in this report. There were thousands of people that the law schools simply didn't report on. Well, why is that? The law schools simply said, oh, we just couldn't get that information. I doubt that. I actually really doubt that. I think most people that don't pass the bar let their law schools know that. But here's one, so that's one game I think that's being played. A second game that's being played that we know about is that there are some law schools that pay their students to not take the bar exam right out of law school. Why? Well, because if they don't take the very first bar exam given after graduation, they're no longer considered first-time takers. So what these law schools have done is to identify what they think are at-risk bar takers. They then pay them, and by paying them, sometimes it's a flat-out stipend, sometimes it's a bar study period, sometimes it's a work and study program. I mean, there's a variety of different mechanisms that are used, but the goal is the same. Sit out the first bar exam, hopefully get ready, then go take the bar. But when you go to take the bar now, even though it's your first time as a bar taker, your school doesn't have to report you as a first-time bar taker. They can now report you as something else, or an other group, or a repeat bar taker, and it doesn't impact their first-time bar pass rate. Now, you can think that's fine, or you can think it's awful. I won't weigh in. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that it's not forthright, but but it's also something that's now understood. There are schools that do this routinely. And as a result, I'm not sure that those numbers are always accurate. So I think there are two things that can happen that make these numbers from the law schools less than forthcoming. The first is simply that they just don't report on everyone, and this report acknowledges that they don't report, or they say they didn't get the information. Okay. And the second is that they don't have to report on people that don't take the exam right out of law school. Now, we also know that there are a fair number of people who get out of law school, don't take the exam for several years because they go off to do other things, then come back to take an exam and aren't reported as well. In other words, the law school says, we're going to move you off of our list. So I think you want to be at least skeptical, if not a good consumer, looking at these numbers and asking yourself, where do they come from? How much reporting is there? How many people did the law school not report on? How many of those people were actually first-time takers but didn't report out that way? And be aware of that when you look at these numbers. We've looked at three of the reasons that I think you want to be at least cautious in interpreting these numbers. The first was the aggregate numbers. The second is that we're talking about a 4-time bar exam taking rate, not a first-time, one-time rate, and that the law schools can play games with the numbers. Number 4 that we want to look at is that this report only applies to first-time bar takers, whatever that means, from ABA accredited law schools, and that's it. Now, that's a big group, to be sure, but it is not the universe of bar takers. Let me point out that it does not include any foreign-trained attorneys who represent a massive group, certainly in California, New York, and Texas, and a growing group in other jurisdictions as foreign-trained attorneys are being admitted to take the exam. They are not included at all, and the pass rate in this group is dramatically lower, something like 15 to 20%, and clearly would have made a huge impact on the overall numbers. And it's a number of applicants that are growing proportionately. Another group that's certainly not included would be state-approved law schools. Now, this is significant primarily in California, but there are some other states that have their own state-approved, but not ABA-approved or accredited law schools. The students that attend these schools are not included in these numbers at all. Their pass rates are also significantly, and by significantly I mean by 50-60% lower than the numbers that we're seeing here. Now, that could be an argument against going to a state-approved or accredited law school. I'm not making that argument here. I'm simply saying it's a big body of bar takers that are not included in these numbers at all, and you should be aware of that when you're reviewing these numbers and how they should be interpreted. It also does not include correspondence law school students. It does not include those people that did LLMs and then come in to take U.S. bars. So there's a number of groups that are not represented in this category. And then within the bar takers category, there's another huge group that's not accounted for at all. And this would be what I would think of as a distant bar taker. Someone that took a bar exam many years ago and is now coming back, either because they're transferring jurisdictions, they're moving, there's been a life change, maybe a career change. Something's happened to cause them to want to come back and take the bar. Maybe for the first time, maybe for another time after having been a member of a bar in another jurisdiction. Now, we see a lot of these distant bar takers at Celebration Bar Review. It's part of the market that we serve. And frankly, these are people who might have been 20 or 30 or more years away from the bar exam, or maybe took the exam 20 years ago and failed and never took it again, and now it's on a bucket list and they want to take it or feel the need to take it. Or maybe their lives have just changed and now it's time to practice law. In any event, this is a large group of people, and they are completely unaccounted for in this study. And I can tell you that this is a group for whom the bar is really challenging and difficult. And when we're looking at states like Florida and California where there's no reciprocity, or New York where there's very little reciprocity, or Texas, again, very little reciprocity, these individuals, even if they're barred in another jurisdiction, have to take the bar exam again. And their pass rate is nowhere near the 88, 89%. So when we look at these three groups, the foreign trained attorneys, the non-ABA accredited law school graduates, and the distant bar takers, we have a large group of people taking the exam who don't come anywhere near these big first-time 3L pass rates that we're talking about here. And you might say, well, I don't care, I'm a 3L. Okay, that's fine. But I will tell you that there's a substantial number of people taking the bar, in fact, a majority of bar takers in some jurisdictions, that come from these three groups. And so the numbers that you're hearing about from the ABA are focused and limited on their constituency, but that is not the entire universe of bar takers, and therefore it's a misleading number if you apply it and say this is the result of the overall bar. It's nowhere near that number. Very few jurisdictions have an 88% pass rate on their bar exam. In fact, when you look at the states and how they've done directly in their bar exam, we can tell you that the highest pass rate was 87% in Oklahoma. That's the highest in the country, first-time bar pass rate. But then we've got states as low as 40% in Puerto Rico, 63% in Mississippi, and that's the first-time pass rates. When we get to the overall bar taker pass rates, well, now we're looking at really small numbers, and that's my fifth point. The first-time bar takers are not actually the majority in many states. Now, let me say that again. First-time bar takers are not always the majority of bar takers, certainly not in the February bar exam. We see that in Florida, we see that in California, we see that in a number of major jurisdictions. Why is that significant? Well, when you take the overall pass rate, what ends up happening is that we've got an overall pass rate that's below 50%. In fact, below 35% in California and Florida, but well under 50% in a number of jurisdictions, or right at 50%. So I think people get confused. They hear that number and then they hear this 88% number and they think, well, what's wrong between those two? Well, what's wrong is you have a whole lot of people that don't fit into those categories. And you have people that are repeat bar takers who tend to repeat over and over and over again because they're just not passing. They keep doing the same thing over again and they're not getting the traction that they need. So the net result of this is that you have a large body of bar takers who simply aren't being represented in these studies, and that tends to give you a distorted perspective on what the overall trend in the pass rates are. You see, what's really going on when you look at the overall trend in the states is bar pass rates are going down. They are not going up. There's a slight uptick in a couple of jurisdictions, but generally, overall, the numbers are going down. So how do you square that with these very rosy numbers from the ABA? Well, you don't. What you say is the ABA is looking at a subset, the happiest subset, the most successful subset that they can. They're looking at primarily 3Ls coming out of ABA-approved law schools at major law schools. That group is going to pass. That group's always been able to pass. But the overall category of bar takers, the overall population of bar takers, is nothing like that. And therefore, the overall numbers continue to drop in jurisdictions. And so when you hear that California has a 66% first-time bar pass rate, that might make you happy, but that's only among ABA-approved law schools. The overall pass rate in California is 30%. And when you hear that Florida's got a 67% ABA-approved law school first-time pass rate, that sounds okay, not great. I mean, it's nothing to jump up and down about, but their overall pass rate is 35%. So you see, it's a very different matter. And I point all this out not to be a curmudgeon, as I say, but simply to point out that you want to look at these numbers with some degree of detail and a little bit of skepticism. You know, really what they should do is keep you from being complacent. What I'm most worried about when I see these kinds of headlines and stories is people thinking, I just go to law school, I graduate from law school, I do what everybody else does, I'll pass the bar. That's the implication of these studies. That is not the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is it's taken people up to 4 times to get into this group that the ABA is talking about, and a whole lot of people don't even get into that group. And there's a whole bunch of folks that don't fit into this nice, neat, tidy category of the ABA is using, who are not doing as well. They are not as successful, and they are more at risk. And it's certainly to those at-risk students that we have taken most of our energy and time and resources. So I guess my point is, if you're watching or listening to today's podcast and you're not a 3L at a top 20 law school, then I think you want to take a breath, look at these numbers in a little more detail, and ask yourself, where do I fit in? How's my law school doing? What's my circumstance? Can I find people in my situation? How many years has it been since I took the bar? Maybe I'm a foreign trained attorney. Maybe I'm a distant attorney. Maybe I went to a state accredited law school. How is my school doing? What's my circumstance? And if you find yourself in one of those at-risk categories, I would really encourage you to avoid taking the lemming big box approach of memorize, recite, and cram. It's not terribly successful. Even when you look at these numbers, they're really not telling you that for all bar takers it works. They're just telling you that for a subset of the group, it works pretty well. And I think if you keep that in mind, then you're in a much better place as a consumer to decide what you need in order to be successful. So I hope that's helpful. I'm sure we're going to hear more about these statistics in the days and weeks to come. We'll continue to dig into it, and I'd love to get your comments and thoughts on today's episode. Well, that's our message for today. Thanks for being with me. I hope that I haven't made things too muddy or messy in looking at these numbers and statistics, but I do want you to be good consumers as you look and listen and read these stories and know what's going on. We'll be back again next week. We'll be getting closer to the result dates, the early results in Florida, and that'll be an exciting time, I know, and lots of good things we hope for people coming up. Now, again, just to remind you, we do have our special webinar, How to Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. That's coming up on Thursday, April 5th, live at 7 p.m. Eastern. Make sure you sign up here on the video page or by going to celebrationbarreview.com webinar and claim your free seat. And then I'll see you again here next Wednesday along the Extra Mile. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at www.celebrationbarreview.com.